what we're going to be looking at today is some projects that Paul and I have done within elastic space. And this just gives you a bit of an overview of elastic space. And it started with a projection that I did onto a building in England. And the project was called Elastic City Spacey. And I realized that in that bag are some 3D glasses that I'm going to give out.
This one?
Yeah. So we don't need them for the whole talk, but I just wanted to quickly say this was what started me into this research project. And previously I'd been working with cave spaces, which are electronic trapped spaces that allow for 3D immersion full body, and that used to be called VR. It's the old VR. So when this projection was onto a building, I found that as soon as people put these glasses on, it was like they'd given their, they were now in this other world. And it was a public square. People lay down on the pavement and started catching the various things that were falling in space. They were screaming. I'd never seen anything like it. So this, and also the space shifts as you move. So it's different than a theater where you're stationary and the perspective is fixed. So that's how elastic spaces arose. So just a few slides here. So it's exploration of 3D VR augmented. And we were also working with a 3D drawing tool that allowed us to draw in real time using gesture. And that was an invention of one of the IMAX founders, Roman Kreuter. And I was working with Roman, his son Paul, and now Roman's grandfather, or grandson, I should say, Chris. Just a bit of a map of the various people and projects that we're working on through time. So UCAM is right here. I think my laser, that's not working. At UBC, we're working with Suzanne Simard, who does the underground communication of trees. Does anybody know about this, the way that trees communicate? So I'm very fascinated with her sense of the tree as the archive and the way that communication occurs through carbon, through nitrogen. And we've been having a lot of conversations about what that means, so non-human communication. A few of our colloques that we've had. So the one on your left shows the initial 3D projection that I did. And then the one on the right is one that was at Concordia. And we've had various mixes of people. It's red at the left, by the way, when you're trying it out. So we'll soon come to some 3D images. I'm just scrolling through. I'm about to take you to a 3D image. Just hold on. Okay, so I'm going to talk over this one. You can put your glasses on now. And they can go over your glasses. So this is a 1-minute clip of a work that showed in Texas as a part of India and its diaspora. It's a series of letters from my grandfather to my father. My grandfather felt he'd lost his son. He'd lost him somewhere in North America. He was writing him 3 times a day from the coast of India, the southwest coast called the Malabar coast. And the paisleys that you see are scans of the paisleys from my grandmother's sari. So it's a story of this sense of loss and dislocation. And I've been playing with 3D as a space that you can enter into for the loss and dislocation. And I'm just going to show briefly another project now. You don't need 3D glasses for this one. So this one, you see I was obsessed with the hummingbird in the previous one. This one I'm obsessed, sorry, the peacock in the previous one. This one I'm obsessed with the hummingbird. It's a project in progress, experimenting with IMAX technologies. So what you see is going to be shown as a 4-story projection. This is a very rough cut, and it starts in darkness, and you'll just hear sound. So there's some sound mocked in, and then there's slashes of movement. So if you imagine you're in a blackened theater, and then there's these slashes of movement. And this is a forest that's been slated for logging on the west coast of Vancouver Island. The trees are about 1,200 years to 2,000 years old. And it's seen from the air, ceiling, but eventually it will go 4 stories. And then I'm experimenting with then a very slow aerial movement. I've been working with very high resolution cameras, so 8K cameras on a drone. So this is, you're seeing in HD, but it will be ramped up. So that resolution is also part of that experimentation with vision technologies. And I would argue that we do have our bodies, and I really want us to have our bodies. So if people get dizzy, it's a sign to me that we still have our bodies. So, over to Paul.
Just have to make a switch here. So I was, after being invited, and I thank again the organizers for the invitation to talk here today, I was also invited to produce or to show a small work tomorrow in the hexagram space at 4 o'clock, and along with my colleague and fellow artist Eric Raymond, we're going to be showing some work that we're working on. So the details of how to see that, I think you should ask the organizers, but it's going to be tomorrow. So I've sort of worked. I just want to talk a little bit about my practice and center this work within my practice, and in part within the practice, within the research group of elastic spaces. So my recent work is focused on the contemporary urban landscape, and more specifically how the body moves through and reacts to and is conditioned by this environment. So I'm just going to show some examples of my work without giving details. You can ask questions later. And I specifically, and also within the work I'm going to be showing tomorrow, I looked to seminal seminal examples of modern architecture as archetypal forms in the contemporary landscape. I look at how the body responds to these structures from near and far, from inside and out. And I will just show you the source images of the work that I'm showing tomorrow, and just make the reference. So this is so there's three sites that I sort of work with just for this project. Although eventually I think there'll be more. This is the Egg Performing Arts venue, which is part of the Empire State Plaza in Albany, New York. Construction of the Egg began in 1966 and was completed 12 years later in 1978, and it was designed by Wallace Harrison. This is the Couvent Sainte-Marie de la Tourette in Eveux in France, and it was designed by Le Corbusier in the early 1960s with elements designed by Xenakis, Yanis Xenakis. And the third is the headquarters for the Enzo Gutzeit Oy, but it's now Stora Enzo, and it was designed by Alvar Aalto in 1962, and it's in Helsinki. So while I work with text, photographs, and drawings, my practice is rooted in moving image experimentation, and pretty much always now with the sort of moving image within space. So the space around, and again tomorrow I'll be doing this, the space around the image is as integral to the work as the image. And so this space is really a space for the body to interact with the image. So the notion of bodies in space that Leila was talking about is also important in my work. Is explored in my work. Although so it's a 3D space, but not a 3D space with, you don't need the glasses to look at it. So these are just some recent work. So this is a piece where there's 5 screens of moving image, and there you can sort of walk around it and position yourself within the space. So filming buildings, as I work with architecture, it might seem to be a sort of pointless activities as buildings are static. But a producer of films for the Open University's Modern Architecture curriculum, Tim Benton, wrote, "Buildings don't move, but humans move through them." So the notion that architecture does imply movement by the body within it, which I like. So to film a building is to film the body or bodies that interact with it. And so what I've been working on for for the project I'll show tomorrow, and I've been sort of more recently working with, is the technique of rotoscoping. So rotoscoping is an animation technique it was developed concurrently with early cinema technologies. It's a method of transferring filmed movement, often the movement of the human body, into a sequence of hand-drawn images. The sequence is subsequently refilmed image by image in order to reconstitute the movement. So what you have here in this image is a diagram of how rotoscoping worked. So there would be a projector. I don't have a pointer like Leila did, I don't think. But there's a projector that projects the image frame by frame, and then a technician or an artist who would draw over it, and then you project the next. So it's an old technique, but I still find it interesting. And of course now with digital methods we can speed it up somewhat, but it's still a very long. It's still a very time-consuming technique. As at least in the way I use it, you still have to draw each frame, even if you're drawing on the computer, you're still manually drawing each frame, so you still have to stop and do each frame. And for me, that's very important. I'll explain later. That's a very important part of it. So, of course, in the 19th century, Jules-Étienne Marey developed apparatuses to measure human movement, and using a predecessor to motion capture device, he could break down into increment parts of movement of a fencer's thrust or a pole vaulter's leap. This research, which sought to understand and instrumentalize the body as a machine, and I think later my colleague's going to be talking about the corps machine, so this is sort of the beginning of that in some ways, was a form of rotoscoping, but directly from the body. So sort of, and then later you'll have rotoscoping was a technique used in early Disney films, for instance, to render the movement of stylized animals as human movement. Disney and others created fantastic creatures that embody at once human and animal traits, uncanny apparitions like Mickey Mouse, Bugs Bunny, or Bambi that resonate profoundly in the collective conscious of the post-20th century. And I think there is something particular about this use of rotoscoping, because it at once we feel we sense the human body and the animal body. So what we see is depicted as an animal, but the movements tend to follow it. But perhaps less with Bambi, but even the movements of the head and things tend to follow human movements. So we identify with them as humans, but they're animals, and it brings back a kind of animism. It's kind of an animism that's sort of latent animism that we've had. It's been in sort of different religions for a long time, but it sort of was kind of reincarnated or re-embodied with these animated films, and particularly with the rotoscoping technique, because the movement is actually the movements of humans. And even Eisenstein recognized the sort of uncanny element of it, and was quite fascinated by it. He said the very idea, if you will, of an animated cartoon, animation, literally a drawing brought to life, is practically a direct manifestation of the method of animism. In this way, what Disney does is connected with one of the deepest features of the early human psyche. So there's something somewhat profound in what's going on in these animations. So I used a rotoscoping. So how I sort of started doing this, and what interested me was I used a technique to refer to a sequence in a film in an online publication. I wanted to refer to a film. It's a film Quintet by Robert Altman. And there's a scene at the end where a figure disappears into a snowy landscape. And I sort of discussed this sequence, and I wanted to use images of it, but I realized on this online publication I didn't have the rights to use them. So I said, well, okay, I'll draw them. So I drew them. And as I was drawing them, I realized, well, I could now animate these drawings, and I did. I'll show you them. What was interesting, and what I found was interesting, was although my drawings were quite crude, in a fixed image, you couldn't really make out the figure depicted. But the movement of the figure walking through the snow was quickly identifiable. So what happened was the movement kind of defined the figure, but not the drawing of the figure. So it was a sort of weird way that movement becomes this sort of reference of a body, and a specific body too, not just anybody, but a specific body that the drawing itself or the image itself does not do. And it confirms that thing. You know, if you see somebody from far away coming towards you, and if you know that person, you'll know it's them, even though you can't make them out. And I'm always sort of being excited, interested by this sort of point of recognition that we have of a body in space, but only through its movement and not through necessary traits that we recognize. So rotoscoping thus creates a representation of a body, and I'll start that is based primarily on its movement rather than on physical appearance. We recognize a corporeal presence, a corporeal signature through movement. So the project that I'm showing thus defines and renders a cinematic body in three ways. The movement that is reduced to a simple line drawing that nevertheless connotes the movements of a body in space, and as drawings they retain the corporal movement and manual gestures of the artist. So my hand is still there. You know, like I said, if somebody else does it, it won't be the same. And that's even if I do the drawing on a touchpad or with a mouse, because we still move a certain way, so our body is moved. And then I did there's a third movement, a third body. It's a movement through the architecture of the film viewer. So because these are put in space, the way we move within the space it becomes integral to the work. So a corporal behavior that is conditioned by a sort of screen culture that we already have within us too. We have a certain way of watching the films. And what happened interesting in the piece tomorrow is that I found there's places that you can position yourself, you'll see it better than others. So you're going to move through the space to try and find it. But although there's not one, I wouldn't say there's one privileged position for looking at it, but we are sort of conditioned to deal with the screen, and there's several screens in this case. So, I'm wondering if it is a sort of micro proprioception that Derek was talking about, of a kind of body working within the space to look at it. So anyway, that's where I'm at. So thank you.